Welcome to My View On, a series of podcasts where experts in the industry give their personal view on some of the big topics making waves in the media. All of the views are the experts' own, providing a fresh look at key issues facing the financial industry. Now, there have been some major changes to the way that dividends on shares are taxed. With me to discuss this is Paul Speight from James Hay. Paul, first off, what's happening here?
Well, one of the most interesting returns that anyone does with their self-assessment is trying to work out how much tax is payable on their dividends. Dividends at the moment are paid to you with a 10% credit that's been paid effectively on your behalf. Then you gross it back up, and then there might be tax payable depending on whether you're a basic rate, higher rate, or additional rate payer. And when you say it out loud like that, it does sound a bit daft. And what the Chancellor has done is sort of taken a broom to that legislation and said, well, for most people, and HMRC anticipate that to be about 85%, by introducing, and what they have done is introduced a £5,000 allowance that says if you receive dividends of under £5,000 a year, then you don't need to, there's no further tax to pay. Now, that's great, and that's going to obviously help a number of savers who no longer will need to go through this grossing up process.
What about those people who are paying more than £5,000, who breach that threshold?
Well, that's the catch-all. So there are a couple of groups of people that are going to get caught by this legislation, and some will be able to do something positively about it and some won't. So who are those groups? So your first one is definitely the owner-directors of businesses who their remuneration strategy has typically been, I will get to the end of the year, my accountant will ensure that I've received an element of pay, income taxable pay, to make use of the various allowances. There'll then probably be a pension contribution, and obviously we're aware that there's legislation that's coming in that's possibly going to affect how much they can pay into their pension schemes. And then the rest is normally distributed by a dividend, because obviously they own the shares of the company. And those people will almost certainly be receiving dividends of over £5,000 a year, one would assume. Now, for them, they are, the additional tax that's going to be payable is 7.5%. And now it depends on different income thresholds, but that seems to be the figure that we're settling on now. For those people, what can they do? Well, the answer is probably not a lot. What the Chancellor's seen is, for an employee who receives their remuneration through PAYE and national insurance, there was a gap for those company directors in terms of what their taxation regime looked like. And what he's done is just taken a move to close that gap. Call to action is it probably isn't going to change the way that they draw their remuneration, but the advisor and the accountant probably need to be engaged to understand the impact of the pension legislation, but also the additional charge that's likely to now be payable on their dividends.
If you were a company director, though, an entrepreneur of a business, you might feel that you've been a bit unfairly targeted, though.
You may, but I would suggest really, in other words, he's closing the gap. I don't think, and we've had a look at it in some detail, that it would necessarily change the strategy. I think they're still better off. I think this is still a beneficial regime for them. He's just slightly narrowed the gap between that and what an employee's taxation position would normally be.
OK, so you mentioned two groups there, Paul. What's the other group that you were referring to?
Well, that's our savers. So they're the people that have accumulated funds in either a share portfolio, or they're running funds, typically probably on a platform where they distribute a dividend. Now, there's two groups, again, I suppose, inside this extra group, which are those people that are going to get caught by this, where they receive dividends of over £5,000. And they're looking at thinking, well, actually, I've now got an additional 7.5% tax to pay on those dividends that I wasn't used to paying. Do I pay that tax, or do I consider perhaps changing the share class of the funds, or actually changing the funds themselves to funds that don't have a dividend, and perhaps take advantage of the new savings tax allowance that's coming in? And then there are those people who don't have £5,000 worth of dividend income, but perhaps have got money in a bank account where they're now over the savings tax allowance and thinking to themselves, actually, I could make use of this dividend allowance if I just move money from here to here, and I can get myself a more tax-efficient income in my retirement.
OK, Paul, thank you very much indeed.